Woodcut has a series called Britain's Most Evil Killers and World's Most Evil Killers. There have been some really good Midlands cases. So we're going to have a deep dive into some of those cases and talk about them in a bit more detail. And all three of them are very unique.
So yeah, this is just a brief overview for the case for everybody. So Colin Pitchfork is known as not just a double child murderer and rapist, but also the first person in the world where DNA was used to help convict him. Now, he was born in 1960 in Leicestershire, and he worked as a local baker, and he already had a history of sexual offending prior to the murders in indecent exposure. He'd done this once before he got married, and then there was a second occasion afterwards. So in November 83, as they say, 15-year-old Linda Mann was found murdered and raped. The case quickly stalled because the police didn't have any viable leads that they could work with at the time. Fast forward 2.5 years, in July 86, Dawn Ashworth, 15-year-old girl, was also found raped and murdered in similar circumstances. The detectives in the case realised that there were similarities between both crimes and that they were likely have been committed by the same perpetrator. At the time of the investigation, there was a young male with learning difficulties who have made some admissions to the police. They were convinced they had their man. He was charged with both, although he denied the murder of Linda Mann. Now, at the same time, as it so happens that there was a Professor Ali Jeffreys at the University of Leicestershire developing a new test, ostensibly to help with paternity identification of children, which used the nascent science of DNA testing. And the SRO approached him, having read about this, and said, would it work for this case? And because there was DNA samples, semen and blood at the scene, the professor duly obliged. And the first two critical things came out of this. The first, the DNA proved it was the same offender. But more interestingly, it also proved the person that had been charged hadn't committed the crime. So the first use of DNA was actually to make sure the wrong person didn't go to prison. The police then decided to use this new technology and set about doing a screening. So over 5,000 males between a certain age group in the villages around Narborough were asked to submit to a voluntary DNA test. Interestingly, only 2 people didn't submit to that test. One had legitimate reasons, I don't know what they were, but the other one was Colin Pitchfork. He had basically, after a couple of attempts, persuaded a colleague to take the test on his behalf. His variation was, well, if I do the test, they find out my previous offending, they'll stitch me up. Sometime later, in August of 1987, that colleague ended up disclosing what he'd done to a friend in a pub. They got concerned, alerted the police. With short order, Pitchfork was arrested, and he admitted the offences, and this was in January 88. So he was charged with both murders, the rapes, and perverting the course of justice. He was initially sentenced to life imprisonment with a 30-year tariff, reduced on appeal to 28. He was granted parole in June 2021, and he was released on licence in September. By the November, he was already back on a recall, having breached its conditions. And in 2023, the parole board again tried to recommend his release, but the decision was overturned by the government because they see him as a clear and present threat.
I mean, that is interesting, and we'll definitely come to the question later of whether someone like that can change throughout their period of incarceration. But I just want to start by asking about his previous offending. He'd been caught twice for exposing himself to strangers, but we now know that he did that 1,000 or more times, which is prolific. To what extent is that kind of what people would see as low-level sexual offending potentially a precursor to worse crimes?
When you speak about precursor, it leads me to believe that he was testing the waters for many years and seeing how far he could actually stretch his criminal offending in order to see if he could do something much more sinister, much more serious in order to fulfill his sadistic values. And this is something that we find inevitably taking place, ultimately resulting in 2 rapes, 2 murders, and 2 elements of strangulation. So you see that the modus operandi over a period of time intensifies and changes, but the precursor to all of this is flashing. And although he was found guilty of flashing twice, once before his marriage and once after his marriage, and subsequently received counseling and some treatment for this, his behavior escalated. And I think there's a reference that he made at some point when he was questioned about Linda Mann's murder, and he mentioned, yeah, that took place, but I didn't flash for 2 years. And it just goes to show where his headspace was at that time, and that he had somewhat gradually progressed from his primary crime, which served as the basis of his criminal offending for the most part of his life. And he was heading into something more serious and sinister that he was somewhat rationalizing and justifying. And these individuals often, we find, and we can draw upon this in a bit, can neutralize their behavior. They can lead a life that allows them to be quite normal, quite acceptable, and quite just in mainstream society, all while doing things in their daily life that allows them to also enter a nefarious and criminal space that has horrific consequences.
I mean, he was capable of being incredibly normal. I mean, as we were talking about this earlier, before the first murder, he dropped his wife at her night class, and he had his infant son strapped in the back of the car before he committed this first murder. And so he was very capable of having these kind of two hats on, really.
Yeah, he was. Night class is part and parcel of how people educated themselves in the 80s and 90s, and even in the noughties. I recall my parents interchangeably doing night classes, so it was quite a normal thing, but it allowed him to seek the opportunity to target victims at the same time. One thing that strikes me about Colin Pitchfork is the fact that he had extensive local knowledge, and he used certain routes and certain areas so as to be able to advance his criminal practice. And this is something that we see in both cases, whereby he has a strong geographical awareness. In the first instance, where he attacks Linda Mann with the premise of flashing to see how far he can go, he left his child in the car, walked out of the car, hopped over the fence, followed Linda Mann, and there was a massive distance between where the crime took place and where his child was left behind. And if you just think to yourself for a moment, as a parent or a carer or someone that has a young sibling, think about the times that you've left your child or that family member for a brief period of time. Even at home, how does that feel? You kind of lose that protective factor, don't you? You lose that control, and you think to yourself, my God, what's my child doing, or what's my sibling doing? In this case, he was able to completely detach himself from that father figure and instantly switch and become this offender, this killer.
My experience with this type of offending, and I've dealt with it a number of times in my career, is the murder and the rape and the ultimate crimes we hear about are just a culmination in a build-up to that. So I'm not a psychologist, but I dealt with many cases where it starts with voyeurism, it starts with upskirting, it starts with stealing underwear off clothes. The number of cases I discovered where people were having their underwear stolen but never reported it to the police. And it was only when I stopped a guy one night walking down the street with a bag he tried to hide under a car, and it was full of women's underwear he'd stolen. It's almost like they get some sort of release from this crime, but then it's not enough. So they have to progress to the next level to get the same emotional outcome from it for them. And this is why it gets worse and worse. And also they go under the radar for so long. I mean, we had a case in Neston in the Wirral when DNA just came in, and we started taking DNA swabs for everybody that was charged with an arrestable offence. And we had somebody with learning difficulties used to flash all over the village. It was like the local joke until DNA testing came in. I took his DNA because it had just come in after the last instance. Merseyside were then investigating 6 or 7 rapes, and he was the one responsible.
Wow.
So he might have been doing that in the village, but he was doing other stuff because he built up to that level of offending, and we weren't aware of it.
Do you think that the police are a lot more aware these days that there is no such thing really as a low-level sexual offence, that they are always part of potentially a drive to something more serious?
I think so. If you shoplift, and you get a buzz out of that, you'll go to the next thing, and then you end up burgling houses, then you end up committing more crime. It doesn't always mean that that's the pathway, but certainly with sexual offending particularly, it usually starts with the lower stuff. And if they're flashing or they're doing other things that are unacceptable, you need to track that carefully. And if you look at most serial rapists and murderers, there was low-level behaviour offending. You'll know more about this than me before they got to that. But from a practical point of view, that's what I've seen and experienced.
He was only caught because this guy eventually probably had one too many in the pub and told someone that he'd given a DNA sample on Colin Pitchfork's behalf. Would he have been caught otherwise? And also would he have offended again? Because the pattern with serial killers is that they they do escalate. They, shorter time between murders, and they keep doing it.
Given what I've read, I think the likelihood is he would have gone on to offend again. The individual concerned, he was convicted for perverting the course of justice, and that's the problem. He might have thought he was doing somebody a friend. But if you actually look at how he persuaded people, he was manipulative as well. So he goes to a colleague and says, look, can you do the test for me? Because if I get caught up in this, they'll just pin it on me because I've got a proven track record of flashing. The first two said, no, not interested. He then goes to the one who did agree to do it by saying, look, a friend of mine is a flasher. I'd done the test for him so that he wouldn't get fitted up by the police. But now I've already given my DNA sample. I'm going to be in trouble if I get caught out. So he then agreed to do it. But I think nerves, alcohol, and knowing probably deep down he'd done something dreadfully wrong, given, as you can see, how that affected the communities. 2 15-year-old girls killed in such a horrendous manner, and people there thinking it's somebody in our communities. So we got the outcome in the end, but he could have been arrested sooner.
And the DNA thing is obviously a humongous breakthrough, and it's something that probably took criminals by surprise because it didn't exist, and then suddenly they were being caught out by it. Do you think it has a deterrent factor when people always does murder not work like that?
I can't talk for murder specifically, but I know, for example, criminals are very aware of what the police do. I mean, as somebody mentioned earlier on today, they look at how the police investigate. They will watch your program and say, right, that's how they got caught. I'm not going to get caught. So an example of some of the high-value burglaries my team worked on in Cheshire, criminals are now going not up, gloved and masked up, but they were taking solvents so that they clean the whole areas and get rid of any DNA evidence. Crime scenes, particularly pre-planned murders, they will be conscious of DNA transfer. But the technology is getting so good now that, even breathing on a piece of paper will leave your DNA evidence. Now that's good, but it also has a flip side that means it's easier to contaminate scenes, which is then what gets challenged in court cases. So we have to be more clever and scientific about how we treat DNA evidence. But it was a game changer for forensics and police investigation around the world, not just here. And it started with this case.
I did read about an incredible case recently where it was in America. A woman had been murdered in her home, and this guy's DNA, who was on the system, it was found in her home, and he was a person with quite a lot of substance abuse issues. And when the police came to him, he went, "It's not the kind of thing I normally do, but maybe I did. Like, I was drunk. I'm not really sure." And so he was convicted because he couldn't provide an alibi. He didn't know who he was. He couldn't say he hadn't done it. And then it was only later that it was discovered that the paramedics that attended this woman's murder had attended him a few weeks earlier when he'd been ill. And there was DNA on their medical bag, and they deposited it in the house. And it was only that discovery that got him out of prison for murder, which he hadn't denied. So it was quite incredible. It's quite scary. Let's talk a little bit about rehabilitation. Can someone like Colin Pitchfork change? He was obviously released and then for whatever reason found himself back inside, but could you let someone like him out and be absolutely confident that he's not a danger to the public anymore?
The simple answer is it's a case-by-case situation. Rehabilitation is extremely complex. So are offenders, so are those that have been incarcerated for long periods of time. We tend to forget rehabilitation isn't necessarily individuals desisting from crime. We also need to factor in and take into consideration, for the most part, majority of those that are in prison today will be released. So they will go through, or should go through, a form of reintegration and then re-entry. And that in itself needs to be looked into with nuance. Individuals like Pitchfork, one can argue, given his peripheral offending and as well as the crimes that he's been convicted for, would suggest that this is an individual that's committed offending over a period of time and therefore can never be rehabilitated. And that can hold some merit to a certain degree and credibility. However, there are some instances whereby we see successful cases of individuals that have committed horrific crimes and horrific acts that have somewhat fully rehabilitated in the eyes of how we view rehabilitation should work.
We're going to come on to a case that is someone who has subsequently been released after committing a fairly horrendous crime. This one takes us back to 1996 in Worcestershire, and it is the case of Tracie Andrews. Can you tell us a few more of the details, Anton?
Okay, so Tracie Andrews, she was 27 at the time of this offence. She had a history of volatile and explosive anger with previous relationships, and it marked her growing up. She began a relationship with Lee, who was 25 years old at the time, and they moved in within 3 months, so it was a rapid burn romance. The relationship was marked by jealousy, by domestic abuse and arguments in both directions. In fact, the police were called there in October 1996, and the friends and relatives of both Harvey and Andrews commented that they were frightened something was going to go wrong. Somebody was going to get hurt. So on the 1st of December 1996, after another bout of arguing, they go to a pub in Bromsgrove where they are supposed to reconcile. But on the trip back, more arguing appears to have erupted. And on a country lane in the village of Alvechurch, near Worcestershire, Andrew stabbed Harvey 30 to 40 times with a knife, and it was the cut to his carotid artery that actually killed him. Andrews immediately gave this story that there'd been a road rage incident. The two males in a blue car had followed them, and some, as she described it, a fat man with scared, starey eyes, which is ironic given the picture that people always show of her, had attacked them both and had committed this murder. And a few days later, there was this famous press interview, which attracted a lot of press interest, in which she released this narrative. Now, at the same time, the police were starting to unpick the story. There were two witnesses who had seen the vehicle prior to the incident, and the police were convinced there was no such vehicle involved. And when you looked again at the injuries Andrews had and the blood spatter analysis, there was something not quite right with it. And whilst they were getting ready to potentially arrest her, she then attempted to take her own life, leaving a suicide note, and she was arrested 6 days later. She persisted with this variation on events through the trial, and in 1996 she was found guilty at Birmingham Crown Court for murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. It wasn't until 1999 that she actually admitted she'd been responsible for the murder. She has been released after serving a minimum term. She was released in 2012, and she changed her name and actually had surgery on the NHS to the tune of £5,000 because the government wouldn't allow anonymity as they did with Maxine Carr. So she tried to argue that she should have had it. So she's out there and about, and I'm not aware she's been involved in any further offending.
As a police officer, it must be unusual to have, I mean, I know that you obviously have an open mind whenever you start an investigation, but would it be fairly far down on the list of possible suspects to have a young woman like this? Because female killers, especially in this kind of context, are relatively rare.
Well, the thing that strikes me about this is looking at the background prior to the murder. They clearly had a volatile relationship. She particularly had a volatile temper, and this had been commented. The police had attended many times. Whenever we deal with a serious injury or a homicide involving a relationship or a domestic incident, the first thing you do is you go back and look at the history, particularly where the police have been involved, and the fact that people had mentioned that both, somebody was going to get hurt here. To me, it wouldn't be a far-fetch at the early outset to say, well, let's look at this story. Yes, we have to analyse the evidence that she's given, but if the facts don't support or corroborate what she's telling us in this case, there has to be another option. And the police were probably looking at her very, very early on. But you need to explore all potential avenues so that you don't get this cognitive dissonance and just feed down one particular line, however unpleasant and unusual it may appear.
Mohammed, if you dig further back into her life before her relationship with Lee Harvey, there are indicators that mentally all was not well with her.
Absolutely. In her formative years, she experienced what's widely known as adverse childhood experiences. This is an individual who didn't really necessarily grow up in a stable family household. Her parents separated at a very young age, and she resented her father for the rest of her life as a result of this. Soon after her parents separated, her mother was able to strike a relationship with a local man who she also resented. So that father figure and the absence was always there. And I feel as though, given the profile, and we just mentioned about her not fitting necessarily the stereotype of a female killer, this was an outward-facing individual. a person who was aspiring to be a model, who worked as a barmaid. So we can see in her day-to-day, she was pretty much the center of attention and someone that craved that attention and felt the need to be wanted at all times and to have the spotlight facing her. And the fact that she never had that from a male figure may also indicate her resentment towards men later on in the years and the kind of fragmented relationships that she had prior to her killing her partner at that time.
There is a suggestion that she snapped in that moment and stabbed him that many times because essentially she saw red. But there are signs, aren't there, Anton, that this may have been premeditated? I mean, the fact that she had a knife about her person?
Yes, I mean, they never found the knife, but clearly she had it on her. I think it was described as a type of Swiss Army knife, style knife. Why you would carry a knife? Yes, the obvious answer would be it's premeditated. Looking at this case, it didn't strike me that this was premeditated. This was a volatile, often violent relationship, both directions potentially, but she snapped and the anger got the better of her. I mean, whenever I've dealt with either people coming into custody who've committed crimes, where they've, to stab somebody once is one thing, but to do it over and over again, I mean, the energy and force and trauma that you inflict when you stab somebody that many times is too horrific to contemplate. So people are doing that in a rage. They become unhinged. It's probably a good way of putting it. So that they're reacting in a frenzy, and it's only afterwards that they start to have to put a narrative in place to explain what's happened. Hence, telling this story, going on television, and frankly, you look back at it now, and you think it was always you, but at the time, and you've got to remember in those days, people didn't look at press conferences in the same way we did looking at the cases we examined this morning. But that was probably one of the first examples of its type where somebody with such a notorious crime behind them stood and lied to the nation about what happened.
And she did have the capacity, even if it wasn't planned, to be very quick thinking. Obviously, I mean, I'm assuming it was her that punched herself in the eyes, for example.
Yeah, I believe it was self-inflicted injury.
Yeah, and she took the knife. There's evidence that she took the knife into her boot to hide it. So she was quick thinking, and she did then carry it through to that press conference. So let's talk about the press conference, because it is fascinating. Mohammed, why would she center herself in that way? Why would she put herself out there for all to kind of scrutinize her?
I think there's this pathological need for attention on Tracie's end that she's had all her life. And to continue that, she had to put herself in front of the media. There's a history of her needing to be under the spotlight, and that national appeal, as strange as it may sound, even under such macabre circumstances, for someone like her with her psychological profile, allows her to play the grieving victim, the shattered survivor, the individual that has created this fictitious, road rage suspect, but at the same time, she's got this narrative in hand that distances herself from the police, all while allowing her to also be the center of attention. So I think there's that constant need that she needs to be at the forefront of any conversation and any discussion that she has control over.
I mean, she did also present kind of an ideal victim for the press to get their claws into, this kind of young, distressed, blonde, attractive woman. And it is kind of makes the perfect kind of cover story for any newspaper. So you can see, Anton, do you think that the police put her up for the press conference knowing that they kind of had their sights on her? Is that something that would happen?
I don't know that was the case here specifically. I'd be surprised if they did that. Given this is a couple of days after the incident, the police have got a lot of work to do. You've got a complex crime scene. You've got ostensibly a victim that's in the public eye. You've got this story that they now need to start either proving or disproving. So I don't think at this early stage they would have said, right, one of our tactics is stick her in front of a camera and see how she reacts. As we discussed before, it's of no evidential value, but it might help if an expert such as yourself looks at it and says, can you give us an idea on where we go next with challenging her version of events, or what would you suggest? But I think here it's not likely that was a planned policy decision.
I mean, it does seem to have, holes do appear to have appeared in her story between her police interviews and that press conference, so definitely the discrepancies were there for the police to then follow up on.
By the time of the press conference anyway, and the police would have been focusing on those lines of inquiry, not necessarily picking apart her interview, though it did make people look at things objectively seeing how she reacted and saying, now the story we're starting to make, our narrative is starting to make more sense now.
And presumably the obvious question at that point would be, given the frenzied nature of the attack and the way her ex was killed by her at that time, why leave her alive at the crime scene? What value does what currency or what serves the purpose of the perpetrators leaving someone like Tracie behind at the crime scene with very minimal injuries comparatively to the victim, Lee Harvey? That in itself would have naturally raised some concerns and eyebrows. Conventional forensic science tells us every contact leaves a trace. And in this instant, similarly to the previous case, it's the proximity that has allowed detectives to be able to narrow down and kind of isolate who the perpetrator is.
Yeah, she had splashes of blood on her clothing, didn't she? It wasn't just from like cradling him as he was dying, but actual splashes that suggested the knife arc, essentially. So she, again, it's not something that ordinary people would necessarily think of when they're trying to get away with murder. But I do find myself, this is a bit dark, but I find myself thinking about, are there ways that she could have got away with this better than she did? Like, for example, would self-defense have been better than just claiming she didn't do it at all? Like, knowing how volatile things were.
Yes, possibly, but you still have to explain away 40 stab wounds.
Yeah.
And the use of the knife. So, yet people do argue self-defense. You know, I've worked personally on murders where that has been that's been what the offender is saying. I was protecting my own life. And yes, you know, in common law, you do have the right to self-defense. But it's a bit like if somebody's coming at you and you punch them first because you think you're going to attack them, you're entitled in law to do that, and you do have a defense to assault. But if you start kicking them when they're down, where was the threat? So, do you know what? If he had been trying to throttle her and she panicked and got a knife that she happened to be carrying for Lord knows what reason and stabbed somebody once or gives him a cut, maybe, but the extent of the brutality involved in this, and like I said, it is a bloodlust. And it takes a lot of effort to kill somebody like this. So, she'd have been struggled on self-defense, to be honest.
She was released from prison, as you say, 2012. You must have had cases, Anton, where you've heard that someone's being released from prison after serving their sentence, and you've sort of thought, oh, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Can someone like Andrews be rehabilitated? Can she just go and now be a normal member of society after doing that?
I don't know. I think it's more likely that Tracie Andrews could be rehabilitated as opposed to, say, Colin Pitchfork. Because with sexual offending, I think it's a lot more complicated. With her, anger management, resetting her values in life. It's not to say, it'd be pointless if we lived in a society and thought there was no rehabilitation for anybody who committed an offence. Most of the people I've dealt with are just good people doing the wrong thing, not bad people doing bad things. So yes, I do think rehabilitation is an option. And the one thing about murder is it's a life sentence. So even though they're released and they're out there back in society, they are still under that potential scrutiny and subject to that. That's the way it's supposed to work. And I know it doesn't always work that way. And I think about the families. I've worked on a case where the 3 people are going to be coming up over the next 10 years to their release. And I wonder how the family are going to react to that. Because I know if it was my family, there would be no such thing as rehabilitation. You've taken a life, you forfeit yours. That's the basic argument with a lot of people. And I can understand that to a degree. But it'd be a sad world if we thought people couldn't ever be rehabilitated in the right circumstances.
Mohammed, she did confess a couple of years after her conviction to what she did. Does this suggest remorse? Does this suggest some kind of awareness of her behaviour?
Yeah, the bout here may be pragmatism versus penitence. Some will argue that the confession that she made several years later that she actually killed Lee was rather than a genuine, remorseful confession, something that would have allowed her to progress through the prison system much better if she showed some remorse and some indication that she's accepted the fact that she's committed these crimes. But there is the other element and the other side of the argument, which would be the fact that she admitted to the crime after her final appeal was rejected. So there was a period of time after she killed, after she was convicted, and that kind of shows the disingenuous nature of whether or not she was actually remorseful and therefore subsequently took full ownership of the crime that she committed.
We're going to come on to one final case, which is, they're all horrifying. They're all awful cases with awful consequences, but this one is especially shocking. This is the year 2000 in Northampton, and the killer was a guy called Phillip Austin. Earlier, Anton, you described this as one of the worst cases of familicide that you'd seen. Tell us a little bit more about the Austin family.
This is horrendous. I didn't know an awful lot about the case until I researched it for this. So Phillip Austin was 31 at the time, from Northampton, working as a forklift driver. His wife, Claire, 31, and they had 2 children, Kieran and Jade, aged 8 and 7. Outwardly, it appeared to be a normal family. There were some strains with control issues by him that had been reported by friends and members of the family, but finance was often a sticking point. He was always worried about the money, and he said Claire liked to spend it. So the couple had actually attended marriage counselling sessions prior to this incident, and he'd had anger management courses as well. So on the 10th of July, Phillip has taken the kids to school. He's gone out to a store and bought a mallet. He's also gone and done some research on a second-hand car. He then comes home, and an argument develops with Claire, which results in him striking her several times with the mallet, fracturing her skull and her shoulder. He's then strangled her with a bra strap, and there's evidence that she tried to escape from the house, but he's pulled her back into the kitchen area, and he's then stabbed her with one knife. The blade broke, and then he stabbed her again with another knife. So 12 times he stabbed her. They had 2 pet dogs. Both of them were bludgeoned to death with the same mallet. Incidentally, the force used actually bent the handle of the mallet when it was found by the police later. After that, he gets changed. He's rang to say Claire's not going to be in work because she got back injury. He then gets money out, buys this car, picks the kids up as if everything's normal from school, takes them out for a drive, buys them some food, and it's believed he gave them an over-the-counter sedative to put them to sleep. He then drives home, puts them to bed, and then strangled both children in their beds before leaving the house. The murders went unnoticed for a week, and it's only when the school contacted Claire's mum to say, "Where are the kids? We can't get hold of your daughter," that Claire's mum and a partner have gone round to the address, and they discover this horrendous scene. Austin, in the meantime, ends up in Cumbria, where he's found several days later by the police attempting to slash his own wrists. And he actually admitted, "You're looking for me. I murdered my family." He tried to plead guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but again, he later had to change that plea because of the nature of the premeditation, and he was convicted and received 3 concurrent life sentences with a minimum term set at 20 years. Again, parole controversy in this one. The parole board twice recommended he was transferred to an open prison, and the Justice Secretary had to intervene on both counts to block any move to a low security prison, citing public danger that he posed, and he remains in prison to this day.
And the thing that always comes, that I just can't get over what it must have been like for Claire's parents to have walked into the house and found not only her daughter, but then grandchildren. I can't imagine that ever leaves you. Familicide is not that rare. It's unfortunately something that comes up relatively often. So, Mohammed, why do people, I mean, primarily men, but why do people kill their entire family?
There are multiple reasons as to why usually men kill multiple family members. In some instances, it's described as family annihilators, where the man also ends up killing himself and completely kills the entire family, including himself. There's not necessarily much of a significant or a narrow understanding as to why this is the case. Largely, it tends to be for multiple reasons. We find that in most instances, there's a psychological disconnect that the individual has, usually the father or the husband, with the rest of the family, and therefore we see this in hints within this case. Having said that, though, however, when researching this case, I found it extremely bizarre to get my head around. And it seemed to me from the very get-go that Phillip Austin had a split personality. This is an individual, just for the record, prior to his conviction, had no criminal background, nothing of significance. An unassuming individual who pretty much lived in the shadows of family members as he grew up, lived a normal life, had a normal, acceptable job, worked, but then eventually he snapped. And when we look into it deeper, we find that there are multiple reasons behind this. And we spoke about this previously. One of the things that keeps on popping up in different manifestations is the fact that he was ultimately emasculated. This was an individual who felt as though that he was losing grip and control of his family at a point when he wasn't necessarily progressing or developing in life comparatively to his wife, who also worked equally hard, who raised 2 children, all while at the same time working part-time. But as the children grew up, she was able to get herself into full-time work, offer financially much more within the family, strive for a better life.
And he clearly, in this case, didn't like the fact, for example, that his wife, now the children were a bit older and they were going to school, she was getting more of a life. She was much more socially interactive than he was. He was quiet. If you look at his family background, he disengaged from his family. I mean, he didn't have, I think he only had 2 members of his family turned up to the wedding. So he was quite isolationist, whereas she was getting more and more outgoing, taking more control. And he may have seen that as a threat. But domestic abuse at control, if it's not checked or dealt with, it can often lead to more serious, and in the worst cases, domestic homicides.
And I think for him at that point, he clearly premeditated his actions, and he realized that he could no longer provide not only for his wife, but also for his children. And I think that was a big factor that played a pivotal role in his decision making.
I mean, he talked after his arrest about a red mist coming down. Does a red mist ever come down to the extent that people can kill multiple people? Is that red mist?
Not in my experience, not with something like this. You know, he might have been so deranged of mind that he wasn't thinking as a normal person, but he's just murdered his wife in a horrendous way. And as I said before, it's not just one blow in anger through an argument, it's repeated blows, strangled her, stabbed her. And then when you look at the details of how he killed the children, it's not like he just drugged them and let them die. There was evidence that he'd used ligatures around both of their throats, and these children had tried to fight that. And his argument was, well, I killed them because I killed my wife. There is no logic. We'll never understand what was going through his mind. But this case is particularly horrendous because he'd obviously planned to do something, and then the steps he took afterwards. Because if it was a murder-suicide, they did it straight afterwards, as we've had cases where that happened. The logic is there, but in this case, he's been out in the wind for several days debating what to do. He's bought a car, he's taken money out the bank account, he's gone off. I don't know if he just drove himself into a cul-de-sac, which is what resulted in him trying to take his life, but this is horrendous.
It is. Is it absolutely, well, they're all awful cases, but it is absolutely devastating. On that not very cheerful note, thanks so much, Anton and Mohammed. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you.